Kids playing in the park, neighbors chatting across the driveway, friends meeting for a coffee. Ordinary activities about which we normally don't think twice. Not anymore. Now prohibited in order to stop the spread of a global pandemic. Such actions could actually prompt a call to one of the so-called snitch lines that many jurisdictions have introduced. If you see something suspicious, should you call? Well, we've got two perspectives tonight. First, we're joined from her home in Calgary, Alberta by Jen Gerson. She's a freelance journalist and co-host of the OPPO podcast on Canadaland, and she recently argued on the pages of Maclean's magazine that you should not snitch. Let's find out why. Jen, how are you managing?
No, I'm doing just fine.
Good, glad to hear it. A week ago, you published your piece in Maclean's magazine with the title, "Don't Let Coronavirus Turn Us into a Nation of Snitches." What provoked you to write that?
I saw the snitch lines coming up right across the country, and to be honest, I found them to be quite disturbing. And there are a couple of reasons for that. And one is, the historical antecedent for snitch lines is pretty dark. These things are widely used in very repressive, very authoritarian regimes as a means of social control. And my concern about them is that in a time of crisis, trying to force compliance upon a population by making neighbors and friends distrust one another is exactly the opposite tactic we actually need. So, my column isn't categorical about this, but it cautions you to really think hard about why you're snitching and whether or not the thing you're trying to report is more important than the relationships you have with the people around you.
Well, this term has come up, COVIDiots. Do you see too many COVIDiots in your daily activities?
No, truth be told, the vast majority of the people I see in my daily activities are complying with social distancing. I mean, I'm in Calgary, so we don't, we don't have the same density issues that, say, downtown Toronto might have. It's not to say I haven't seen people screw up, but truth be told, I think 90% of the population is doing the best they can. And the other problem that I have with the idea of COVIDiots. It's not to say that there aren't COVIDiots or there aren't people who are callous or whatever. I mean, of course there are. But you don't know what's going on with an individual in that individual circumstance. You just cannot know. There are limits to your knowledge. Is that person a COVIDiot, or is that person absolutely desperate and at the end of their rope and tether? I mean, it's fundamentally unknowable by you.
Can you give me an example of that where somebody might see a circumstance and think, aha, you're not following protocols, I'm going to snitch on you, but in fact there is a more logical explanation as to what's going on?
Hey, anybody have kids? Because let me tell you, after 6 weeks of being cooped up inside, I mean, we think in Calgary we've been luckier than most, but in a lot of places, if you've got a young child who's been cooped up inside, let me tell you, you've been dealing with literal, almost endless screaming to go out. You're dealing with the mental health effects of this isolation on children. That is absolutely heartbreaking. It's soul destroying to have to deprive your children of what they essentially need to be functional and happy. So I would just use that as one example. And when I think about somebody coping with that and then feeling like they can't take their kid out to kick a ball in a park, which by all evidence appears to be a perfectly safe and sane activity to do right now, even now, and then being afraid to do that because they're afraid like their neighbor is gonna snitch on them. I mean, that's not a recipe for a happy, healthy society that can maintain these restrictions basically indefinitely.
Let's compare and contrast the actions of two big city mayors in the country. Here in the capital city of Ontario, John Tory is very supportive of Torontonians taking the initiative to report on the misdeeds of rule breakers, either by telephone or by posting their complaints on a website. Naheed Nenshi, your mayor in Calgary, what position is he taking on all this?
Actually, I couldn't tell you specifically what Nenshi's taking. I mean, I think that in Alberta generally, we've been a bit more lax about some of these rules. I mean, we're not, most of the stories about the crazy bylaw officers who are coming down on people for taking push-ups in park or pull-ups in parks or lingering too long in benches, that kind of stuff that they acknowledge isn't actually a health and safety risk, but they're doing it because, they have to do this, or, that might lead to unsafe gatherings in the future. It's kind of like a slippery slope argument, right? That seems to be predominantly coming out of Ontario and predominantly coming out of Ottawa, really.
Well, let me ask you about the pure politics of this, because even before COVID-19 struck, The mayor of Toronto's popularity ratings were through the ceiling. You know, he's on his second term right now, and his numbers are very strong. He's urging people to do this, and he's urging it in a city and a province which has pretty good compliance for all of these things so far. So in terms of being in touch with sort of the aspirations of his people, can you say he's not on the right track?
Well, look, if you want me to have a takeaway from this virus, one of the things that's been actually striking to me, if we're revealed in a crisis, a lot of people around us have revealed that their natures are fundamentally authoritarian, that they like the idea of someone in a position of power telling them how to live and how to behave, that they actually really buy into the idea of government by fear and rulership by fear. That has been very, very disturbing to me, to be perfectly blunt. I think that right now we're in the height of a panic. I think that the fear is justified. We're in a really dark, hard time right now. So, people are looking to allay their own fear. They're looking to deal with their own frustration, and they're looking for leaders to just come in and make this better for them. So I understand where people are coming from right now. I understand why they're using their emotions in this way. But to be blunt, I think that, when this passes, when the pandemic passes, when the fear passes, what we're going to have to deal with is who we allowed ourselves to become in order to cope with it. So, just it's not to say that, and I'm not categorical about never snitching. I do think that there are appropriate times when it is the right thing to do. If you know someone who is behaving in such an irresponsible way that they are actively putting people in imminent danger, like we're talking like someone who's tested positive for COVID is like running into long-term care facilities or something crazy like that, then yeah, I would say that is an appropriate thing to snitch on. But if you're just snitching because you see somebody in a park, and you're angry and you're upset and you're coping with your own emotions by dialing a snitch line, I just think that might be an opportunity for you to sort of evaluate your own emotional state and find out if that is the appropriate thing to do. Because I do think that these sorts of tactics are very, very dangerous for social cohesion, and they're very, very dangerous for people in times of crisis when we need each other, we need to rely on each other enormously.
Jen, I can't give you an example that is as categorical as the one you just suggested, but I can tell you that in the capital city at Queen's Park this past weekend on Saturday, I think, there was a bit of a demonstration. I don't want to exaggerate it. There weren't thousands of people there, but there was a decent sized crowd of people who were gathered, who were not particularly practicing physical distancing, and they had their signs and they were chanting at Doug Ford, the premier, who was inside the legislature at that moment having a press conference. And when he found out about the protest going on outside, he called them a bunch of yahoos for behaving so recklessly as to endanger the health of so many people. I'm not sure that's something that we necessarily would have thought Doug Ford might say 6 months ago, but he has become a real crusader for sticking to the protocols. What do you make of all that?
Well, I have no particular objection to that. I mean, those Canadians are doing a dangerous thing, but they're also exercising their rights in a free society. And Doug Ford is absolutely correct to call them yahoos
Well,
and correct to call them out for it. So, like, I don't really have an objection to that. I don't
well, how
think that,
about
that
this?
either
You
of those
say
things are
they're
inappropriate.
exercising their rights in a free and democratic society, except that we're under a state of emergency here, and we're not supposed to gather in groups of more than five unless they're all members of your family that you've been living with. So,
Yes, they're putting their lives in risk. That's very dumb.
period, full stop?
Yeah. But you know what? If you want to live in a free society to some extent, you have to accept the right for people to be dumb and to put their lives in risks in ways that you find unacceptable. That's what it is. We don't live in China. We're not coming in to, nail the COVIDiots into their doors. That's not appropriate.
Would it have been appropriate, though, if any of us were walking by that demonstration at the time for whatever reason? Maybe we were out having a stroll in Queen's Park and we saw them all. And if we'd known somebody who was behaving that recklessly as to gather in so many numbers and so tightly together, would it have been appropriate? I know you wouldn't like it, it wouldn't be pleasant, but would it be appropriate to snitch on somebody under those circumstances?
Well, what do you expect would be the outcome of that snitching? I mean, okay, so you'd feel better, definitely, because you'd do the call and you'd feel really good about yourself. But what do you think is actually going to happen? Like, do you think like a police officer is then going to show up at their house and arrest them or fine them based on your anonymous tip? Would that be appropriate? Like, what is the imagined outcome there? Also, I mean, I think it's a bit naive to assume that the police didn't know who was there. I mean, they were there already. I don't, I'm not sure it was necessary, but I just don't understand what people think the outcome is going to be. Like those, if there's somebody who's non-compliant with social distancing, do they think that the person is going to become compliant because they get a knock on the door from the officer? Or do they think that is it equally possible or plausible that that knock on the door from the officer is going to like that person's going to force sorry that is going to cause that person to double down on their non-compliance?
Hmm.
Like I don't think it's actually the snitching that does any good. I don't think that if you're manning a snitch line and you're getting tens of thousands of calls about non-compliant people, it's not like any city, any country has enough people to actually investigate all those claims and arrest people and find them. So the purpose of the snitch line isn't actually to find people who are non-compliant. The purpose of the snitch line is to force non-compliance by imposing a state of fear. That's the
Okay.
point.
Jen, just in our last 30 seconds here, tell us some of the feedback or the reaction that you got to your original piece in Maclean's.
I think most of it's been very positive. I think that there are thankfully a lot of people who saw some of these tactics being employed and were very disheartened and disturbed by them. Some people disagreed with me. Some people think that saying "don't snitch" is a reckless position, and I accept that position. But to be honest with you, most of it's been supportive from what I've received.
Jen, it's really good of you to spend some time with us here on TVO tonight. Of course, we wish you and your family much good health and good safety during this time. So be well.
You too. Thank you.
As we just discussed in our conversation with Jen Gerson, this past weekend, a small cluster of protesters gathered on the south lawn of Queen's Park, opposed to the government's shutdown orders. Premier Doug Ford called them a bunch of selfish yahoos. That might be particularly apt, according to our next guest, who sees the merit in snitch lines. Melanee Thomas is an associate professor of political science at the University of Calgary, and she joins us now from the Stampede City. And as soon as those words came out of my mouth, I realized there's not going to be a Stampede this year, so maybe I can't call you the Stampede City. Anyway, Melanee, it's good to see you again. Thanks for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Last week, you published a piece in which you wondered why some folks, this was your line, some folks today simply don't want to comply with COVID-19 rules and why we have to make them. Let's start with the first part. Who are the people in your judgment who just don't want to comply right now?
So, by way of caveat, the research that we're pulling on is decades old, and it's a revision on how people typically used to think about how human behavior was. So if you looked at previously at, particularly at behavioral economics several decades ago, the assumption was that everybody was a rational, self-interested, short-term thinking actor where they would just maximize what was best for them in the moment. And then research came along and confirmed that actually most people aren't that. In fact, most people are, if you give them a good argument with clear and open communication, you can get them to act in a kind of collective good. And so I think the good news piece that I'd like to take out of the work that we were drawing on is that most people are actually not, in fact, these short-term self-interested thinkers, but there still is a good sizable majority of folks who aren't going to follow along with, say, public health rules in a pandemic unless they can be convinced that it's really good for them as individuals in the right now. And that's the group that we were initially focused on when we wrote the piece.
Well, let's just share some of the numbers that you came up with here. This is the breakdown in population of, let's call it social temperaments here. The 4 groups. Willing participants, 65% of us, apparently. That's pretty self-explanatory. We are willingly going along with what our governments are recommending. Then there's a group called rational egoists, which you clock in at 20%, and they are the ones that only care about their own self-interest to the exclusion of everyone else. Then there are 2 other groups. They're called the altruists at 7.5% and the punishers at 7.5%. And I guess it's these latter 2 groups who make up 15% of the population that we need more information about. Who are the altruists and the punishers?
So the first thing I would say is that these are ideal distributions. I think if we get everything right about something like COVID-19, that these are the numbers that we're going to see. In general, altruists are people where they will always be motivated by doing good things for other people. And so in a context like COVID-19, altruists are the ones that would be making face masks in their kitchen and sending them out for free to folks, providing bagged lunches for anybody who might need it, things along those lines. And so they just kind of need to be given the space to do their thing, and the altruists will go and do altruistic things. If you compare it to, say, recycling, altruists are the ones that collect other people's bottles for them and then give the money to charity, right? We all know folks like this. They're not the majority, but we all know people who are like this. Now, punishers I find really interesting, because punishers are the people in lab studies who will actually spend their own money out of their own pocket to try to punish somebody who refuses to follow the rules. So they'll try to punish somebody who free rides to try to maximize whatever benefit they could get for themselves. And when we think about, I think it's interesting, since we wrote this piece, anger has shifted away from the egoists towards the snitch lines. And I find this evolution kind of interesting. But one of the things that we want to communicate really clearly is that we're just identifying diverse motivations. We don't really judge these motivations in any kind of way. Like, we're not saying that some are better than others or good or bad. Clearly some viewers will be doing that, which is fair. But for us, like, all we want to observe is that there will be people who will feel the need to punish what they perceive as rule breaking. And this is why we think having really clear, crystal clear communication about what the rules are, and then in the context of a snitch line, a really targeted instance where people can call in to report a violation. Think about calling to report a poacher, thinking about specific instances of, say, Crime Stoppers. I'm not sure if they have that in Ontario, but it's a kind of crime information line that we have out here too. These are, I think, the best instances where we see public policy already using the motivation that exists amongst what we call the punishers. I'm sympathetic to people who want to say that this is kind of counter-democratic, could be used in a nefarious kind of way, which is why we would make the recommendation that the boundaries on the ability for people to actually exert this kind of punishing drive is really limited. In the absence of this, so in the absence of actually a publicly sanctioned or a policy sanctioned way of doing this, our worry is that some people will descend into being vigilantes, which is like an absolute worst case scenario in our view. And so part of this is figuring out how we can balance motivations to have a complete policy response, to avoid and to minimize the most kind of authoritarian or coercive parts of ways of being able to do policy.
But if you've broken down these groups accurately, and these are the correct numbers, it suggests that these snitch lines are not going to be very much used, because only 7.5% of the population feel the need to punish, right?
But the willing participants do need to see the punishing happening, as do the egoists. And so this is why we present these distributions as ideal, because willing participants also don't want to feel like they're stupid sheep. And so if they see somebody who is acting in their short-term self-interest, not putting themselves out, doing the discomfort of physical distancing, things along those lines, if this is what a willing participant is seeing predominantly, and they see it going unsanctioned, they will be like, why am I the fool who's following these rules? These rules are terrible. I don't want to keep doing this. Nobody wants to keep doing this. I'm going to stop doing this. And so the thing with the willing participants is that they will go with what they perceive to be the predominant social norm. And it's usually the egoists that will offset the participants, but the egoists need to have the threat of sanction be real, which means that either they need to be sanctioned directly, so it needs to be active, or they need to see the sanction for them to say, okay, it really is in my short-term self-interest to actually follow the rules. So if you get more egoists to fall in line, the willing participants see those social norms. And so the punishers are small, but that threat of sanction and the actual like public application of sanctions for people who are, say, having house parties without maintaining physical distancing, things along those lines, this is why that becomes important.
Now, we've seen lots of examples of how generosity can become socially contagious, but can being selfish also be socially contagious?
This is exactly what one of the cruxes of our arguments is. And so if all somebody sees is people acting in their short-term self-interest, so not maintaining physical distancing, not staying at home as much as possible in the COVID-19 context, but there's any number of other examples that abound. You see people speeding all of the time, say, and you never see anybody getting caught. This is a good example too of how it's, I don't want to say that it's kind of like a lead follow effect or a monkey see, monkey do, but in a context like this where we need to have the maximum amount of people like following these rules as closely as possible, then rule breaking becomes really dangerous precisely because people will follow the rule. They'll follow what they see the most. And so you can imagine that there's going to be pockets where you're going to be more likely to see rule breaking than rule following. And so this is why the sanctions on that behavior have been escalating over time. And this is also why we argue that providing space for people who want to or need to, because that's how their brains work, need to exert that kind of punishment is key. Now, the one thing I want to acknowledge explicitly is that nobody likes to be sanctioned. Nobody likes to get a speeding ticket. Nobody likes the idea that somebody is calling them out for a perceived rule violation. It makes people very angry to be on the receiving end of this, just as it makes some people really angry to actually watch the rule breaking happening in person. So for me, like a good example is I'm a runner. Calgary's got an extensive path system along our river network. And there are some sections of the path where it's actually really easy to get 2 meters of distance between people. And yesterday when I was on my run, there were several people who they had the space and they refused to use it. And in my head, I'm thinking, you should tell them that they're leaving half the space than what they should. And like the social sanction against, for me, especially the social norm against calling somebody out was stronger than the new social norms that we're trying to build. And so this suggests to me that I'm probably not a punisher, which I think I probably already knew. And so this is the thing where I think people who are concerned about this being all about vigilantes or people really wanting to really be terrible to their neighbors, we think you can mitigate this by having these clear rules with clear sanctions that are clearly communicated. It's this clear, open communication that's the absolute mandatory thing to build trust across everyone. In the absence of that trust, this is when we start to really run into problems. And in the absence of clarity and precision, this is when things like snitch lines can be used for really nefarious grounds. But on the other hand, I would point out that we have lots of these lines. People don't like them because I think that they're worried that they, who normally don't ever get called out, are suddenly going to get called out about this. Contrasted to, say, other folks, if you're looking at, say, racialized populations, they're heavily policed already, which means that I can understand that concerns that exist amongst those communities persist in this particular context, which is why we really want crystal clear communication, really narrow boundaries about when it's expected that this stuff should be used.
Well, and they can be vehicles for much mischief making. And that is one of the points that, I don't know if you know Michael Bryant, but he used to be the Attorney General of Ontario. He's now the head of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And he recently said that snitch lines are notoriously unreliable and bad government policy. He said they're an outlet for rage and anxiety and basically not worth much more than that. What's your response to that?
But it's totally normal for people to be feeling a lot of anxiety right now. And so having the ability for that communication to be as open as possible. So I always come back to communication on this one. And I think that would be consistent with civil liberties. It would be consistent of my read of how Canada has done rights-based legislation since the introduction of the Charter. Having open, clear communication will reduce that anxiety. Having meaningful sanctions that are consistently applied to people who don't follow the rules, that we're all asked to follow the rules, will minimize the rage. And so if there's a clear media communication, say, of rule breaking happened here, this was the sanction that was applied, it's very public, again, the communication is open and clear and contextualized, that will minimize the anger. And I think where things get a little bit fuzzy, and this is the really challenging part for COVID-19, is that there's simply a lot that we don't know about what's going on with the virus or the best way to deal with it. So I have some folks that are saying we should all be wearing masks, even though the evidence is really quite murky about that. Lots of people are pinning hopes on things like herd immunity. And again, the evidence, there's just a lot of things where the actual research-based answer is we simply don't know. And so it's hard to have as clear and as open communication as I think we need to minimize the anxiety and to minimize the anger. But the goal should always be to minimize the anxiety and to minimize the anger. So the solution isn't the snitch line, but the real mechanism needs to rest for everybody on that really clear, open communication. That's how the trust is built. And then for some folks, they need the sanction. That was our focus when we wrote the column, is why do some people need the sanction? Why are some people prepared to follow the recommendations just because it seems like a good idea and are motivated by we're all in this together, where some folks are more motivated by, I need you to make it important for me in the short term to do these sorts of things.
Well, you certainly have been clear and open, so we're grateful for that. Melanee Thomas from the University of Calgary, thanks for coming on TVO tonight. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.